At the city clerk's office, my sister said, "We already filed without you." I asked for a copy, read the date, and then I felt something inside me fold in on itself. The paper was smooth and ordinary, but the ink on it sliced cleaner than any blade. My own family's signature sat there, each looped in confidence, sealed in neat strokes, and I searched for mine as though by mistake it had been overlooked. But it wasn't. There was no line for me. They hadn't forgotten me, they had erased me. The clerk behind the counter looked away politely, as though trained not to watch when blood drains from a person's face. My sister, arms crossed, shifted her weight with the same casual impatience she always carried when she wanted me to hurry up and not make a scene. I held the paper closer, forcing myself to read the date again, as though proof might change. It was filed 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks of conversations I wasn't a part of, decisions made in kitchens and phone calls without my number, whispers that kept me comfortably in the dark while they fastened the door shut. My sister said something else, practical, brisk, about how it was already settled, but her words blurred, like I was underwater. I remember only her tone, the clipped authority of someone who expected no resistance. I gave the paper back. My hands trembled once before I studied them. I asked nothing else, not there, not with the clerk listening and the walls of that office smelling of dust and ink and every tired family who had stood before. My sister turned, heels tapping the floor, leading the way out as if we had both finished some small errand together. I followed, but not because I agreed. I followed because my knees had forgotten how to resist. Outside, the late afternoon sun struck hot against the pavement, and I blinked hard. People passed by carrying grocery bags, toddlers tugging at mother's sleeves, men loosening their ties as they headed to their cars. Ordinary life. I wanted to stop someone, anyone, and say, "Do you see what she just did? Do you see what they've done?" But no one would care. To them, we were just two women walking down stone steps, one in front, one behind, nothing unusual at all. I thought of my mother then, how she always said that betrayal didn't come with horns and smoke. It came in soft hands and familiar voices. It wore the face of someone who had shared your childhood bedspread, who knew the stories of your scars, who could mimic the way you laugh. And yet it struck deeper because of that very closeness. I had brushed off her warnings as dramatic once, but in that moment, they rang like prophecy. We reached the curb. My sister pulled her phone out, thumb flying across the screen, already somewhere else in her mind. She didn't look at me when she said, "It's for the best." Just those 4 words, neat and final, as if stamping a conclusion. I wanted to ask her, the best for whom? For her, who always wanted control. For the others, who never asked me what I thought, what I felt, what I needed. Or for me, who was expected to take the scraps of their decisions and dress them up as acceptance. But my mouth stayed closed. Silence is heavy, and that day, it pressed me into obedience. We didn't ride together home. She had someone waiting, her husband's car sliding into view as if rehearsed. She slipped inside without a pause. The window lowered just enough for her voice, "Try to understand." Then it rolled up, cutting me off. I stood alone on the sidewalk, the air trembling with the sound of her engine as she drove away. For a long moment, I didn't move. I pressed my palm against the railing of the courthouse steps, cool metal grounding me. People brushed past me. Some smiled politely. A man held the door for his wife, their laughter trailing behind. I felt like a ghost among them, my body here but my presence invisible. Eventually, my legs carried me down the street. I walked without direction, past shop windows filled with dresses and discount signs, past a bakery that smelled of sugar and butter, past a busker whose guitar strained against traffic noise. All of it seemed distant, blurred. My thoughts circled one phrase, "We already filed without you." Over and over, like a drumbeat that quickened my pulse. I ended up at a cafe we used to visit together. Once, it had been our meeting place, where my sister and I sat for hours with cups of tea, sharing secrets too fragile for our parents. I hesitated at the door, then pushed it open anyway. Inside, it smelled the same, roasted coffee, pastries warm behind the glass. The same man stood behind the counter, older now, lines deeper, but his greeting was as cheerful as ever. "1 tea, please," I heard myself say, though my throat was tight. I carried the cup to the corner table where we once sat, its surface scratched with years of elbows and spilled sugar. I folded my hands around the warm porcelain, willing it to steady me. I tried to remember laughter here, whispers shared, moments when her eyes met mine with a bond that felt unbreakable. Had those moments ever been real, or had I imagined the permanence of them? The tea scalded my tongue when I drank too fast. Pain at least felt honest. I stared at the window, watching the street move, and let my breath come slower. In the reflection, I barely recognized myself, shoulders hunched, eyes hollowed with something deeper than fatigue. It wasn't just the betrayal that aged me in that hour, it was the sudden realization that my place had always been conditional. My belonging was not my right, it was their allowance. I finished the tea, left the empty cup behind, and stepped back into the evening. The air had cooled slightly, carrying a breeze that lifted the edges of my blouse. My feet ached from walking, but I didn't want to stop. I needed to keep moving, as if distance could unspool the knots tightening in my chest. When I finally reached home, the house felt different. My key scraped in the lock the same as always, but inside, the walls seemed foreign, unwelcoming. The framed photographs stared down at me, birthdays, weddings, holidays. Smiling faces where my sister's hand always rested on someone's shoulder, where her presence filled the space like a banner. I had thought those images meant unity. Now they felt like evidence, of her always at the center, and me orbiting just close enough to be used when needed, forgotten when not. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands resting flat against its surface. The quiet tick of the clock grew louder with each second. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I traced the wood grain beneath my fingertips, remembering how many meals had been shared here, how many arguments softened over plates of food. I wondered if I would ever sit at this table with her again, and if I did, whether I would ever taste food without bitterness. That night, I lay in bed but did not sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional car passing on the street. My thoughts spiraled. Every memory of her surfaced, the time we hid under the same blanket during a thunderstorm, the time we pooled our money to buy our mother a gift, the time she braided my hair before school. Each memory now felt tainted, repainted with the knowledge of what she had chosen to do. I turned over, pulled the blanket tight, and told myself I would not let this undo me. Yet the hollow in my chest grew, and I realized this was only the beginning. By dawn, the decision had been made without words. I would not confront her yet, not shout or demand explanations. I would carry this wound in silence until I understood what it meant. But something had shifted. I felt it in the way I rose from bed, in the way I folded my sheets, in the way I brewed my morning tea. Life had divided itself neatly, before the words, and after. And I was stepping into the after, whether I wanted to or not. The morning after, I moved slower than usual, as though every action was padded with unseen weight. I boiled water, set out the tea bag, stirred in honey, all by habit, yet nothing tasted the same. I carried the cup to the porch, hoping the cool air might clear me, but the sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain. It matched me too well. I kept replaying her voice, "We already filed without you." The words folded over themselves in my memory, echoing at odd hours, intruding on even the most ordinary tasks. I tried to shake them away while sweeping the floor, while watering the plants, but they clung like burrs. By mid-morning, I picked up the phone. My sister's number sat at the top of my contacts, as it always had. I stared at it, thumb hovering. What would I even say? Ask her why? Ask her how she thought I would accept being excluded, erased from a decision that shaped the family we both belonged to? But I already knew her answer. She'd say it was practical, necessary, for the best. She would frame it as responsibility, not betrayal. I set the phone back down, pulse quickened as if I'd run. Instead, I called my cousin, Mira. She lived in another city now, but she had always been my confidant. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, yet when she answered, her voice was warm, instantly grounding. I didn't tell her everything at once. Instead, I started with the clerk's office, the paper, the date. Slowly, the details spilled out, until I was confessing the raw truth, that my own sister had chosen to push me out, and I didn't know how to stand anymore. Mira listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush me. When I finished, there was a silence on the line that felt like she was holding me through it. Then she said, "I'm not surprised." Her words startled me. Not surprised? She explained gently how my sister had always wanted control, how she spoke with a certainty that left little room for anyone else's voice. Mira said she had seen it long ago, though she hadn't wanted to burden me with it. But it doesn't make it hurt any less, she added quickly. I know it feels like the floor's been pulled from under you. I held the phone tighter. I wanted to argue, to defend my sister, but the defense felt weak even in my mind. Maybe I had been blind, or maybe I had simply chosen not to see. Denial is a kind of love, after all. We talked for almost an hour. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter, though not healed. Sharing it aloud made the betrayal real, but it also made me less alone with it. Still, the ache lingered, a bruise that would not fade overnight. That afternoon, I found myself cleaning the kitchen with unusual focus. I scrubbed the counters until they shone, polished the kettle, rearranged the spice jars. The order soothed me, as though reclaiming control over small things could balance what I had lost in larger ones. I realized, as I lined up the jars alphabetically, that I was angry. Not just hurt, but angry. Anger was sharper, clearer. It cut through the fog of disbelief. When the mail arrived, I sorted it mechanically: bills, advertisements, a letter from the bank. Among them was a card from my niece, my sister's daughter. She had drawn a lopsided flower on the front, her handwriting uneven but earnest. "Love you, Auntie," it read inside. I stared at those words longer than I should have. They were innocent, untouched by whatever choices her mother had made. I pressed the card to my chest and felt tears slip down, quiet and unbidden. Children still saw me. It was the adults who chose not to. That night, I cooked for myself, simple food, rice and lentils, comfort I could manage. At the table, I lit a candle. The flame's small, steady glow felt like companionship. As I ate, I thought about how rituals matter most when everything else feels stripped away. I chewed slowly, swallowed carefully, as if teaching myself again that I could sustain myself, even when others withheld what once felt guaranteed. Later, I opened the drawer of old photographs. I had avoided them for years, too busy to sort through, too wary of nostalgia. But now, I wanted to see. There we were, children on bicycles, teenagers leaning against a school wall, adults dressed for family weddings. In every frame, my sister and I were close, her hand on my shoulder, my face tilted toward her. Proof that once, at least, there had been closeness. I traced the edges of one picture with my fingertip, then slid it back. As midnight drew close, I found myself writing. At first, it was only fragments, half-sentences, scattered thoughts. Then, words strung themselves together into something like a letter, though I knew I would never send it. I wrote about the day at the clerk's office, about the way her voice cut me, about the silence that followed. I wrote about the tea that scalded me, about the photograph I couldn't look at too long, about the child's card that nearly undid me. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes blurred. Then I folded the pages and slipped them into an envelope without an address. Sometimes the act of saying it, even on paper, is the only way to breathe. Before sleeping, I stood by the window. Rain had come at last, streaking the glass, pattering on the roof. The world smelled cleansed, though I felt far from clean. Still, I let the sound soothe me. Rain has a way of reminding us that endings and beginnings often arrive in the same breath. When I lay down, I whispered to myself, "This is not the end of me." My voice was hoarse, shaky, but it was mine. And for the first time since that afternoon, I believed, even faintly, that there might be a path forward, though I couldn't see it yet. The days that followed blurred, but each carried its own sharp edge. I moved through them as if carrying something breakable in my chest. At the grocery store, I caught myself avoiding the aisle where we used to shop together, comparing brands, laughing at our different tastes. Even the smallest routine seemed haunted now. Word spread quickly, as it always does in families. An aunt called one evening, her tone full of sympathy but laced with caution, as if she had been warned not to meddle. "I'm sure it wasn't meant to hurt you," she said gently, though I could hear the pause before she spoke, the doubt she was smoothing over. I thanked her, told her I was fine, then hung up and stared at the quiet phone. People loved to soften the edges of cruelty, but it didn't dull the cut. At work, I kept my head down. My colleagues chatted about their weekends, upcoming weddings, renovations at home. I smiled where required, answered questions, kept my grief folded neatly inside me. It struck me how betrayal demands a double life, the one where you carry on, and the one where you unravel in silence. At lunch, I sat by the window, pushing food around my plate, pretending to eat while my thoughts circled back to that paper, that date, those signatures. One evening, I saw my sister's car outside our parents' house. I had gone there unannounced, craving the comfort of the familiar walls, the scent of my mother's gardenias. But seeing that car, I froze on the sidewalk. I couldn't face her, not yet. Instead, I turned away, walking past slowly, like a stranger. The ache was sharp. Being pushed out of decisions was one thing, but being pushed out of places that once felt like mine was another. I went home and found myself pulling out my journal again. Writing had become a nightly ritual, a place where my anger could stretch its legs without judgment. I wrote about walking past my parents' house, about the invisible line now drawn between her and me. I asked myself questions I couldn't answer. Was I complicit in this? Had I given her too much space, too much power, too much deference over the years? Or had she simply taken what was never hers to claim? The next weekend, Mira called again. She asked me to visit her in her city, just for a few days. At first, I hesitated. Travel felt heavy, the thought of leaving my routines daunting. But she insisted gently, reminding me that sometimes stepping away is the only way to see clearly. So I packed a small bag, caught the train, and let the landscape roll past my window as though it might wash me clean. Myra's home was bright, full of books and plants. She welcomed me with an embrace that lingered. For 2 days, I sat at her kitchen table, drinking tea, laughing at small things, and for the first time since that afternoon at the clerk's office, I felt lighter. She listened when I spoke, and when I fell silent, she let the silence breathe without filling it with advice. On the 3rd day, she said, "You know, you don't have to wait for them to see your worth. You can live it, even if they never acknowledge it." The words settled deep. I didn't respond right away, but they followed me on the train ride back, humming in my thoughts. Back home, I began to notice how my solitude was shifting. It was no longer just emptiness, it carried possibility. I rearranged the furniture in my living room, not dramatically, but enough to make the space feel new. I took down some of the family photos that had grown heavy to look at, replacing them with paintings I had bought years ago but never hung. The house felt less like a museum of what was lost, and more like a place I could choose to inhabit. Yet anger still simmered. When the phone rang and my sister's name appeared, I didn't answer. She left a message, brief and neutral, about a family gathering next month. I replayed it twice, listening for regret, for softness, but there was none. Just business, as though nothing had happened, as though she could erase the wound with an invitation. I deleted the message. I wasn't ready to stand in a room where her shadow stretched longer than mine. One evening, I walked through the park near my house. The air was cool, leaves trembling with the early signs of autumn. Families gathered on benches, children raced bicycles along the path. I watched them and thought about how belonging works, how fragile it is when you place it entirely in someone else's hands. I had let my sense of place rest on the approval of my sister, of the family structure she held together like a knot. And now, with that knot pulled tight without me, I stood apart. But apart did not have to mean diminished. Apart could mean free. I began small. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. It was something I had always meant to try but never did, too busy attending to others' needs. The first evening, my hands trembled as I shaped the clay, the wheel spinning beneath my palms. It was messy, uneven, but it was mine. I walked home that night with clay still under my fingernails, a quiet pride nestled in me. Not everything felt like progress. There were nights I still woke with anger choking me, replaying old arguments, inventing words I wished I had said. There were mornings when grief sat so heavily on my chest that even boiling water for tea felt impossible. Healing is never a straight path. But the balance was shifting, slowly, toward something I could bear. And yet, beneath it all, I still wanted her to see. I still wanted my sister to acknowledge what she had done, to admit that excluding me had cost us both something irreplaceable. I wondered if that day would ever come. As the month drew to a close, I stood again by the window at night, journal in hand. The city lights glowed faintly, steady as stars. I whispered the words Mira had given me, I don't have to wait for them to see my worth. Saying them aloud felt both defiant and tender, a reminder to myself that healing could begin even in the absence of apology. The family gathering my sister mentioned arrived sooner than I expected. I had planned to ignore it, but when the day came, my phone lit up with reminders from relatives, subtle prods that carried both obligation and guilt. I told myself I could skip it. Yet by evening, I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at dresses. I don't know what pulled me there, maybe habit, maybe some quiet desire not to vanish entirely from the fabric of my family. I chose a plain navy dress, one I'd worn often. As I zipped it up, I thought about how clothes can become armor, how they can shield as much as reveal. My hands shook as I tied a scarf around my neck, the gesture more about grounding myself than decoration. The gathering was at my parents' house. I drove slowly, each street heavy with memories. By the time I reached their driveway, cars were already lined along the curb. Laughter spilled from inside, warm and familiar, yet it stung like salt in a wound. I sat in the car for a long moment, my fingers wrapped around the steering wheel, before I forced myself out. Inside, the air smelled of spices and candles. My mother greeted me with her usual embrace, her hands lingering at my shoulders. "I'm glad you came," she whispered, a softness in her eyes that told me she knew more than she let on. My father patted my arm, a wordless gesture of welcome. For a moment, the ache loosened. But then I saw her. My sister stood near the dining table, laughing with cousins, her voice bright, commanding the room. She turned when she felt my presence, her smile polite, measured. "You made it," she said, as though my attendance were a pleasant surprise. There was no apology, no flicker of regret. Just that calm, practiced tone that implied everything was normal. I nodded once, my mouth dry, and moved past her. Throughout the evening, I felt her shadow stretch across the room. People gravitated toward her stories, her gestures, her laughter. I hovered at the edges, speaking to an aunt here, a cousin there, but always feeling the weight of being peripheral. The food was rich, delicious as always, but it turned to paste in my mouth. At one point, my niece tugged at my hand, pulling me to show me a drawing she had made. A house with flowers, stick figures holding hands. "That's you," she said, pointing to one figure beside hers. My throat tightened. In her world, I still belonged. I knelt down, hugged her close, and whispered, "Never forget that." Later, as people gathered for dessert, my sister approached me. She carried 2 plates, offering one. "Here," she said simply, holding out a slice of cake. I took it, our fingers brushing briefly. The contact was electric, not with warmth but with everything unsaid. We stood side by side for a moment, the silence thick. Then she said, "I hope you're not holding on too tightly to all that." Her voice was low, almost coaxing, as though she were asking me to let it go for everyone's comfort. I looked at her, really looked, at the lines around her eyes, the certainty in her posture, the way she expected the world to adjust around her. For years, I had let it. But not now. You didn't give me a choice, I said quietly. Her face flickered, just for an instant, before she smoothed it back into neutrality. It's complicated, she replied, and then she turned away, as if the conversation were settled. The night ended with polite goodbyes. My mother pressed leftovers into my hands, my father hugged me tighter than usual. My sister waved from across the room, her smile easy, as though nothing had passed between us. Driving home, I felt the weight of words unsaid. But there was also a strange clarity. I could no longer expect her to change. Waiting for recognition from her was like waiting for rain in a desert. If I wanted peace, I would have to find it elsewhere. The next morning, I woke with a different energy. I cleaned the house, not with the desperation of before, but with purpose. I opened windows wide, let the air in. I pulled out old projects I had abandoned, half-finished embroidery, books I had meant to read. The hours filled quietly, and I noticed I was breathing easier. In the evenings, I returned to pottery class. The wheel no longer felt foreign. My hands learned the rhythm, the clay yielding under my touch. One evening, I shaped a bowl that held together, smooth and balanced. When I lifted it off the wheel, I felt a pride that surprised me. It was small, imperfect, but it was something I had made with my own hands. I carried it home as though it were treasure. I began walking in the mornings too, before the city stirred fully awake. The streets were quiet, the air cool, dew still on the grass. I watched the sun climb, painting the sky in slow strokes. In those walks, I thought less about her, more about myself, what I wanted, what I could still create. Each step felt like reclaiming ground I had given away for too long. Yet at night, when the house was silent, the ache returned. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how betrayal could sit so comfortably beside love. Because despite everything, I still loved her. That was the cruelest part. I loved the sister who braided my hair, who shared secrets under blankets, who once held my hand in crowded rooms. And I hated the sister who erased me with a signature. Both lived in her, and both lived in me. One evening, Mira called again. I told her about the gathering, about my sister's words, about the silence that swallowed us. She listened, then said, "Maybe she'll never see it the way you want her to. Maybe your healing doesn't depend on her recognition. Maybe it's about you choosing not to carry her shadow anymore." Her words sank deep. I sat with them long after the call ended, tracing their edges in my mind. Choosing not to carry her shadow. Could I do that? Could I lay down the weight I had held so long? I didn't know. But I knew I wanted to try. That night, I took the envelope of unsent letters, the ones I had written in anger and grief, and placed them in a box at the back of my closet. Not destroyed, not forgotten, but no longer sitting on my desk where they dictated my days. I whispered to myself as I closed the lid, "This is not the end of me." And for the first time, I believed it not as defiance, but as truth. The weeks after the gathering stretched into a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and strangely grounding. I no longer woke each morning braced for confrontation or apology. Instead, I began waking with softer thoughts: what to cook, which book to read, whether the clay I had shaped the night before had dried well enough to fire. The betrayal had not lessened, but it had shifted, no longer a wound bleeding freely, but a scar I was learning to carry. Still, reminders were everywhere. At the grocery store, I overheard a neighbor talking about her sister visiting for the weekend, the easy affection in her voice like a blade against my chest. At work, someone asked if my family was close, and I hesitated before saying, yes, in some ways. It felt like a lie, but also not entirely false. Love still tethered us, however frayed the rope had become. One evening, my mother called. Her voice was low, as though she were speaking from another room. She asked if I was coming for Sunday dinner. I hesitated. "She'll be there," my mother added softly, unspoken layers filling the pause. I said I'd think about it, and when we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the candle I had lit out of habit. The flame wavered, then steadied. I realized I wanted to go, not for my sister, but for myself. To see if I could stand in that room again without shrinking. Sunday came. I chose a simple sweater, comfortable shoes, nothing that felt like armor. When I walked into my parents' house, the familiar scent of baked bread and herbs met me. My father smiled, my mother hugged me longer than usual. My sister was already there, helping set the table, her movements efficient. She glanced up, offered a polite smile, and said, "Hi." I returned the greeting. No more, no less. Dinner passed quietly. Conversation flowed around the table, cousins debating politics, my father telling his story, my niece asking questions with her bright curiosity. I joined in where I could, careful not to hover at the edges. When my sister spoke, I listened but didn't let her words anchor me. For once, I didn't measure myself against her presence. I was simply there. Afterward, while everyone cleared dishes, I stepped outside to the porch. The night air was cool, the stars faint through a veil of clouds. I breathed deeply, letting the quiet settle in me. Then I heard footsteps. My sister appeared beside me, her arms crossed against the chill. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "You've been distant." The words struck me, not for their truth, which they carried, but for the audacity. I turned to her, searching her face. Did she truly not see the reason? Or had she decided the reason was irrelevant? "You left me no choice," I said finally. My voice was calm, not sharp, though I felt the old heat rising. She sighed, looking away. "It was complicated," she repeated, the same refrain as before. But this time, I didn't let the phrase hang like finality. "No," I said quietly. "It was convenient. For you." Her mouth opened, closed again. For once, her certainty faltered. She shifted her weight, glanced at the door as though she wanted to retreat. But she stayed. "I thought it would be easier," she said eventually, almost too low to hear. "Less conflict." The admission stunned me. Not apology, but a crack in the armor. She had chosen exclusion for ease. My chest tightened, but not with rage this time. Instead, it was a strange clarity. She hadn't acted from malice, but from cowardice. It hurt just as much, but it was a different shape of hurt. "I would have preferred the conflict," I said softly. "At least then I would have had a voice." She didn't reply. The silence stretched between us, thick as the night air. Finally, she turned back inside, leaving me alone with the stars. I stood there longer, letting the cool wind brush my face, feeling both heavier and lighter at once. That night, lying in bed, I thought about her words. Easier. Less conflict. My anger flared, but so did something else, resolve. If she wanted ease, I would not give it to her. Not through shouting or demands, but by refusing to disappear. By carving out my presence where it mattered most, in my own life. Over the next weeks, I leaned into that resolve. I joined a small book club at the library. At first, I sat quietly, listening to others analyze stories. But gradually, I began sharing my thoughts. My voice felt tentative at first, then steadier, until one evening someone said, "I love the way you put that." It startled me, how long it had been since anyone noticed my words with admiration rather than dismissal. I also began cooking new recipes, dishes I had clipped from magazines years ago but never tried. Some failed miserably, others filled the kitchen with scents that made me smile. I invited a neighbor over once, just to share a meal. We laughed over burnt bread, and I realized how nourishing it was to open my home without fear of judgment. And in pottery class, I shaped a vase tall and slender, its curves imperfect but graceful. When it emerged from the kiln, its glaze shimmering faintly, I placed it on my windowsill. Each time I passed it, I felt a quiet surge of pride. It was proof of patience, of persistence, of creation born from my own hands. Still, there were nights when the ache returned. I would dream of us as children, running barefoot through the yard, chasing fireflies. I'd wake with tears, the memory sweet and cruel at once. Some wounds, I realized, never close fully. They become part of the body, carried always. But alongside the ache, something else was growing, a kind of steadiness. I was beginning to see myself not only as the sister excluded, but as a woman capable of building a life that held meaning beyond that wound. Each small step, a walk at dawn, a shared meal, a finished piece of pottery, stitched something back into me. One evening, as I lit the candle on my kitchen table, I whispered the words again, "This is not the end of me." The flame flickered, steadying into glow. I believed it more now. Not as defiance, not as fragile hope, but as fact. And for the first time since that day at the clerk's office, I could almost imagine a future that was mine alone, not defined by what had been taken, but by what I chose to create. Winter arrived slowly that year, creeping in through early dusks and breath visible in the morning air. I noticed it most on my walks, when the grass was crisp with frost and the trees stood bare, stripped down to their quiet honesty. There was something comforting in that, the idea that even nature accepted its seasons of loss. By then, the wound from the clerk's office had scabbed over, though it still throbbed when touched. I had stopped waiting for calls from my sister, stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. The silence between us had stretched long enough to become its own presence, a wall I could lean against rather than try to climb. I no longer counted the days since we had last spoken. I let time be time, carrying us both forward whether we wanted it or not. One evening, my mother invited me to help decorate the house for the holidays. I hesitated at first, gathering still carried the risk of seeing my sister, but in the end, I said yes. I wanted to reclaim the simple act of stringing lights, of unboxing ornaments, of breathing in cinnamon and pine without letting grief choke me. When I arrived, the house smelled of baking, my father humming quietly as he strung tinsel on the banister. My mother handed me a box of ornaments, her eyes soft but watchful. We hung them in companionable silence, glass spheres catching the glow of the fire. At one point, I lifted an old ornament, a clay star my sister and I had made as children, our initials carved in the back. I held it longer than necessary, tracing the uneven edges, before hanging it near the window. My mother's hand brushed mine briefly, a silent acknowledgement of everything left unsaid. Later that night, as I left, I saw my sister's car pulling into the driveway. For a moment, I considered turning back, hiding inside until she entered. But then I stopped. No. I had run enough. I stood by my own car as she stepped out, her breath curling in the cold air. She saw me, paused, then gave a small nod. "Heading out?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Yes," I replied simply. The silence between us stretched, filled with everything we hadn't said. Then, unexpectedly, she added, "I hope you're well." It was a small sentence, almost nothing, but it carried more than the polite word suggested. I looked at her, searching for sincerity. Maybe it was there, maybe it wasn't. But for the first time, I realized it didn't matter. Her words, her recognition, her approval, they no longer dictated the shape of my days. "I am," I said, and it was the truth. We stood in silence for a moment longer, then she turned toward the house, and I toward my car. We didn't embrace, didn't exchange apologies or promises. We simply moved in separate directions, the cold night carrying us both. And strangely, that was enough. Back home, I lit the candle on my table and poured tea into the clay mug I had made in class. The flame flickered, the mug was warm in my hands, and I realized I felt whole in a way I hadn't before. Not unbroken, the cracks remained, but whole nonetheless. Life rarely gives back what was taken. Instead, it asks us to build anew from what is left. Over the following weeks, I leaned into that truth. I hosted my book club once, filling my living room with voices and laughter. I gifted a small vase I had made to my neighbor, her gratitude genuine. I planted bulbs in the frozen earth, trusting they would bloom come spring. And through it all, I carried myself differently. Not waiting, not shrinking, not measuring my worth against someone else's decisions. I was not erased. I was still here. On New Year's Eve, I sat alone on my porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching fireworks bloom in the distance. Each burst lit the sky briefly, then faded, leaving darkness again. It struck me how life was like that, moments of brilliance, moments of silence, both necessary, both fleeting. I thought of my sister, of the paper at the clerk's office, of the words that had cut me. I thought of the walks at dawn, the pottery beneath my hands, the laughter in Myra's kitchen. All of it was mine, the pain and the healing alike. And then, softly, I whispered the words that had carried me through, "This is not the end of me." It was not defiance now, nor even comfort. It was fact. I stood, went inside, and closed the door behind me.